Guys, you're going to love today's episode. It's with my sister, Vera Schmitz. She's always such a blast. She's a co-founder of Dwell Differently. And we're talking about true religion. What does it mean to be truly religious? And is that a bad thing? Isn't religion kind of like a fake thing? Well, we're going to find out today. We're also going to find out a little bit about what it means to have the heart of God and to keep free from being polluted by the world. What does that mean? Well, listen in and find out. Hey, I'm Natalie Abbott.
And I'm Vera Schmitz. We are sisters who host the Dwell Differently podcast.
We help you memorize and meditate on one Bible verse every month. And all month long on our podcast, we talk about what that verse means, why it matters, and how we can apply that verse to our daily lives. Hey, welcome back to the Dwell Differently podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Abbott.
And I'm our sister, Vera Schmitz. And guys, today we are jumping into our verse for June. We're going to talk about all the complexity of it and the importance of it. How do we actually live it out? The verse comes from James 1:27, and it says this: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world.
First off, that word religion, I want to talk about that. But just this idea that there are things that we can do that God says that's acceptable, and there are things that we can do that is not acceptable before him. And one of the things that we can do that is acceptable is to look after orphans and widows. And if you haven't listened to the teaching episode yet, go back and listen to that, because our modern day concept of orphans and widows is a lot different than the context of the time in Jesus's day. And then also this idea of being polluted by the world. What does that mean? So my first question for you, Vera, these come from the kit that we send out to all of our members. My first question is, the word religion sometimes has negative connotations in our culture. What are some of those connotations? How is the word religion used in this verse, and how is that different? So what are some negative connotations do we have for the word religion? Like if you say that person is really into religion, or that's a super religious person, is that like a positive thing or a negative thing, or just like a mixed bag?
I think it's funny. I was just listening to Preston Perry, Jackie Hill Perry's husband, was just talking about this concept on his Instagram or something, I think. But he was talking about how we kind of got to get back to like using that word. Like we've gotten nervous to use it or afraid to use it. And really the word actually describes a good thing. It's just gotten a little bit fuzzy. And I think for me, when I think about when I made the flip of not using that word anymore, was when I heard friends or classmates talking about religion in a negative way, like, ugh, it's so religious, or like churchy. Like it was like always in a negative way, like the things that you're doing, reading your Bible and going to church, like it's all just these religious things that you're doing. And that there was no relationship there. It was this idea that these were these tasks that I'm checking off. So religion is actually bad. What I want is a relationship. And so I stopped talking about, oh, I'm a religious person. And I would start to say like, I'm a spiritual person, or I have a relationship with Jesus that's changed everything. I would never talk about the word or use the word religion, because I felt like it communicated something I didn't want it to communicate. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think about like, if you say somebody's a religious person, or we even use the word to mean like somebody who is like almost overcommitted to something, like a type A kind of alliance with something, where it's like, well, I must do these things. And it's like you said, sort of like a list of duties. So like a religious person almost feels to me like not necessarily as a person who has any faith at all, but as a person who is
legalistic, maybe.
Yes. That's the word I'm looking for. Like that just is holding on to sort of this way of life that they think is the right way of doing things. And they are just so committed to it above everything else. And I think that idea too, where we kind of get this sense where it's like, well, religion is different than a relationship. And obviously I want a relationship with Jesus. But when we see this verse, it's saying that no, religion is a good thing. So how is the word religion used in this verse? And how is it different from maybe some of those negative connotations that we would have culturally? I think honestly, like the way that religion is used in the Bible, the way that it's used in this particular verse is it's saying the way that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless, right? The way that you live out your faith. So religion is an expression of your faith.
What you believe.
What you believe. And so maybe that's why it's become such an ugly word to us, is because some of the things that we actually believe in are not gospel. They are not Jesus. They are, if I do this, then I'm going to be pleasing to God, or I'm going to be viewed by other people as being sort of perfect or good or whatever. And that would be a false religion. Right. And so maybe that's what we're making that distinction there, is the difference between sort of this false religiosity and true religion. I think there are some verses that, in fact, I remember memorizing this verse in a different version that says true religion instead of just religion that our Father accepts. So that idea of religion that's actually pure and faultless, or true religion, that's what's acceptable to God.
It's like, are the actions plugged in to faith, or are they unplugged? You know, it's like, what are we operating out of? Are we operating out of a duty to do these things because that's the right thing to do? Or are we plugged into faith and we're motivated by the love God has for us to do the things that we're called to do? You know, caring for others who are marginalized, and looking out for people who need our help. Like, if we're just doing those things out of a duty, it's not getting after God's heart. You know, it's not getting after like who God really is. Who is God? God loves the marginalized, and he wants, and caring for the people who are on the outskirts. He also wants our heart. It's not just about caring for people. It's also about getting to our heart, you know?
Yeah. You're starting in on our answer for the next question I was going to ask, which is, how is serving those who can't pay you back a way of expressing the gospel and reflecting our God? And I think you're right. I think that when we are caring for, in this instance, like the reason that this verse says orphans and widows, I think that's sort of just a shorthand for anybody, like you said, Vera, who is marginalized or oppressed or not cared for by society. People who don't have a means of taking care of themselves or paying you back. That's who James is talking about here. He's challenging us. If you want to live out your faith in a way that is acceptable to God, our Father, in a way that is pure and faultless, then take care of orphans and widows, or the people who are the least cared for in our society and cannot pay you back. And I think that's honestly, like, that's what Jesus has done for us. It's exactly what you were just saying a second ago.
Well, and when you've experienced that kind of kindness, when somebody has done something for you that you cannot pay back, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I can think of times when people have cared for me beyond what they should have done. Like, I should have owed them something and I owed them nothing. And that is one of the greatest forms of loving somebody, is to give something without wanting anything in return, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like, in terms of not even like in this instance, it's even more magnified, because it's like you're giving something to somebody who not only are you not expecting to pay you back, but they actually are incapable of paying you back. So that's the real crux of the matter, is that we express the gospel when we love people who are incapable of paying us back, because we are incapable of paying God back. What he has done for us in Jesus Christ he's given us everything. He's given us a relationship with him. He's given us clean hearts and his own righteousness and forgiveness of our sin and heaven and eternal glory. And I don't know about you, but I don't have anything that could possibly
I've got nothing.
back. I got nothing.
Yeah.
So if that's how we've been treated by our Father in heaven, how can we not give other people the same kind of affection? How can we not, in a very like minuscule, minute kind of way, reflect that and image that for other people to experience that and to experience just a taste, like a tiny taste of who Jesus is by reflecting him in that way?
Well, and so many of the stories of Jesus in the Gospels are like our favorite stories are this picture. This is Jesus loving the person on the far outskirt. Like always, that's all he does is he's out there healing lepers and hanging out with sinners, hanging out with sinners. And, it is why we love him. And so it's just an opportunity we're being called into what we actually love about Jesus,
Yeah. And the reverse is also true. Like I think of the parable that he tells of the unmerciful servant who owes this like massive millions of dollars worth of debt, and he is forgiven. He's about ready to get thrown into prison, and his master, I can't remember if it's a king or a lord or whatever, forgives him this massive, huge debt that he could never pay back. And he turns around and he goes to somebody that owes him money and threatens to like throw him in prison if he doesn't pay him back right away. And I'm like, that's the reverse. Like if we have been given such just magnificent blessing and such huge forgiveness and such amazing status, how can we then turn around to our brothers and sisters and shake them and say, you owe me $5?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's what we're actually doing. I love when Jesus gives these kind of images, these stories for us to hold on to that are like, man, that's gross. And yet, do I do that?
Do I do that? Yeah. That's the thing is like that's a hard story to put your feet in and see yourself as the one turning around and demanding to be repaid, But I think if we, take a true inventory of how we treat others, we might be surprised to see ourselves actually doing that. Maybe not as aggressively, but
just holding on to a grudge, just holding on to that. Or, I not that this verse directly talks about this, but I think that there is this implication though. If we can love the people who are the least loved and the least cared for in our society and the people with the least amount of status, then we should also be loving the people who are our friends and our church people and our family members, and not holding them to some kind of standard and say, you know what, you don't deserve that. Because I think sometimes those are the people that it's easy to give a granola bar to a homeless person. It's a whole lot harder to give forgiveness to somebody who's hurt you. So
that's true. That's very true. Hey everybody, Vera here. Guys, we wrote a book. It's called Dwell Differently, Overcome Negative Thinking with the Simple Practice of Memorizing God's Truth. And in this book, we memorize 10 Bible verses to help you combat your negative thinking. We memorize truth for when you feel unloved, truth for when you feel insecure, truth when you feel unaccepted, truth when you're anxious, depressed, afraid, when you need direction, when you can't pray, when you need rest, and truth when you have troubles. Guys, these verses are beautiful anchors for your soul. They are the very words of God, and they have the power to completely transform our lives. So we want to invite you to get these words into your head and into your heart. You can find the book at dwelldifferently.com or at any major online bookstore like Amazon or Target.
All right. Well, I got one last question for us today. And it's talking about that second half of the verse, the other part of the religion or that practice of our faith that is acceptable to God our Father. And that is to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So, what are some of the things of the world that might corrupt your faith? Are they all bad things? And how can a good thing still pollute your faith?
Yeah, that second half is really interesting to me because we are called to be in the world, but not of the world. So here we are, our little lights out there in the world that is, threatening to pollute you, to shake you or rock you or disrupt you, corrupt you. So it's tricky because we're called into the dark places and yet we need to keep our light. And I think when I'm thinking about that question, I think for me, the thing that threatens to pollute my faith the most is the hard things in the world. The things that cause me to wonder and challenge, like, is God good? And that could easily rob me and make me not trust in the Lord. So I'm thinking about like watching the news is one thing. There's nothing wrong with watching the news. It's good to be up on things. But there is a point of no return with the news. We all know that.
Right.
And like, at what point does consuming all the horrible things going on in the world actually pollute my faith and cause me to question God's goodness? That is something that I learned about a decade ago, that maybe 8 years ago, that the news actually was polluting my faith for sure. And I made a real conscious decision that I consume very little news, and some of you might judge me, but I actually mostly get it through my husband, because I found myself feeling so overwhelmed and anxious that I was having a hard time putting my trust in the Lord. And so instead, I'm like, hey, Matt, can you like consume this? Because it doesn't really affect him the way it would affect me. And just tell me what I need to know when I need to know it. And the freedom that I have and the ability I have to keep my trust in the Lord and to not pollute my faith with all of the barrage of the negativity, it's such a gift to me.
I love that answer, because I think like the second question that I asked is, are they all bad things? Like, the news isn't a bad thing.
I should know what's going on in the world. Like, that is important.
You should, and that's okay. But I think it's not inherently a bad thing. And yet it can be a thing that rocks your faith and becomes a rabbit trail that you go down. I think there are a lot of things like that.
What's one for you?
There's that idiom of like, too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. Well, I'm just thinking about too that, when you're talking about this verse, it's talking about you're supposed to look after orphans and widows. So in the eyes of the world, those are the people that you're not supposed, like, nobody cared about in Jesus's day. There were no like organizations to help with that or whatever. And so Jesus is saying, like, rethink the way that you understand what's important. Don't be polluted by what the world says. And so I think there are a lot of things in the world that the world says is good. Like, I think at this point in our society, our world would say, yes, taking care, or at least American society would say taking care of orphans and widows is a good thing. We should do that. There are people who are not religious or not people of faith who give lots of money to orphans and widows, which is great. But just because the world says something is good doesn't necessarily mean that it is good. And so I think that there are things that I consume or take in from the world that, if I'm not careful and filtering them through the lens of the Bible, I can just accept and believe and live like that's normal. I think consumerism, I've been reading through Proverbs recently, and there are so many Proverbs about the deceitfulness of wealth. And there's this one proverb that I was meditating on a couple of days ago, and I can't remember exactly what it said, but it basically said, don't fix your eyes on making money because it will fly away, essentially. And it's true. Like it's such a fleeting thing. And I think sometimes when you look at Instagram or you follow certain people or whatever, I mean, you could literally spend a million hours looking at, I've been trying to buy patio furniture. And it's like at a certain point, I have to say, this is too much of a good thing. I don't need to scroll and 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 find the absolute best perfect thing. Because of what I'm doing in that instance is I'm believing the lie that this thing is going to make me happy. It's going to, if I get just the right thing and if I get it for just the right price and like, who cares? Who cares? And I know that's kind of seems like a really surface level thing to be polluted by. I would just say that's what God has laid on my heart recently is like, how am I using my money? How am I using my time? And am I being faithful? Am I being biblical with how I'm allotting those things? Or am I giving myself permission, because the world has given me permission to just be a consumer and to consume and consume and consume. And as long as I have the money in my bank account to spend it, then who cares? It's fine, right?
So who cares? Yeah. I mean, even the idea of like the one lie I believed on this specific topic is like that I have to go and find the absolute best deal. And I pay for it with my time.
Right.
And so it's like, and don't get me wrong, like frugality isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing to be wise with your money. But at some point, like even that can become too much of a good thing where you spend all your time only like, I'm thinking about like around Christmas time or a birthday where you're just like exactly what you're talking. You look up and you're like, I've been looking for the perfect sleeping bag that's at the right price. And I spent 3 hours doing that. Like, what was I like? What just happened? So I think that that's a really good word because I think a lot of us, it seems like a small thing, but it's actually our everyday things that make up a big part of, who we are,
Yeah. And what's interesting to me about this verse is that I feel like at first glance, I'm like, look after orphans and widows and don't be polluted by the world. Feel like two things that are very far away from each other, right? It's like, oh, well, this over here and then that over there. But I think that they're far more related than we would consider at first glance. I think there's something about caring for the less fortunate, for seeing other people with compassion and generosity and kindness that actually helps keep our hearts from being polluted by the world. It keeps our hearts pure because it's like, how can I love the most vulnerable and the least cared for and at the same time be super self-indulgent and embrace whatever the world wants me to embrace?
It would be really hard to do that. It's like if you're going to serve at your church at a coat drive or something, it's like when you do that, when you leave that has changed you. That has changed you. And it's like anytime that I've ever served in that way or given in a way to help others, you go back and you're like, blah, look at all of my excess. You know what I mean? It really does. I think what you're saying, it will shift the needle on how you spend your time and your money and your treasures.
Right. And the thing, I'm not saying you shouldn't have nice things at all. I'm simply saying like, how are you obsessing over those things or, thinking somehow that those things are going to fill you up? Like we have needs and and God provides for us and meets our needs. And that's a beautiful thing. And yet I think when we are loving and caring for people who have less than we have, it actually opens our eyes to how we can maybe misunderstand our own needs and our own desires, and to be able to say, that's not a desire, that's actually good. I need to let that one go. All right, Vera, we are out of time.
We're overtime.
But yeah, thanks for going to overtime with us, guys. I don't know who won here, but I think maybe we both did. Is that overtime tie? I think that only happens in soccer. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, may we be truly religious people as we think about this verse. May we be people who live out our faith in ways that that are pleasing to God and that reflect him in the world. All right,
Amen.
Vera, we will see you back here again next month. And thanks for joining me today.
Every time.